I'd like to welcome our friends, our neighbors, Boynton Society members, students to Björklunden and to a really wonderful event this afternoon. If we could start with the ceremonial silencing of cell phones. I always feel like that's a nice way to begin these sort of events. I'm Jason Brozick, Professor of Governance and International Affairs at Lawrence, and I have the distinct pleasure, maybe I should say the distinct pressure this afternoon of introducing one of my personal heroes. Russ Feingold served the state of Wisconsin in the U.S. Senate for 18 years, including high-profile positions on the Foreign Relations and Intelligence Committees. In the Senate, he built a well-deserved reputation as one of the most principled members of Congress, working across the aisle with people like Senator John McCain on campaign finance reform, but also standing alone, even alone within his own party, by being the only senator to vote against the Patriot Act. His commitment to campaign finance reform continued after the Senate in 2011. He founded Progressives United, an organization dedicated to fighting the Citizens United decision. Most recently, Senator Feingold has dove back into academia, with visiting positions at Marquette and Stanford Law School, and writing While America Sleeps, a wake-up call to the post-9/11 world, a New York Times bestseller that many of our students have read. And this fall, I've been honored to work with him at Lawrence as this year's Distinguished Visiting Scarf Professor, a position that was established years ago to give students the opportunity to engage with men and women with hands-on experience in foreign policy and international affairs. Just this weekend, for example, Senator Feingold joined me, 3 other faculty, and 24 students to discuss the future of warfare, including drone strikes, how we address veterans who are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with post-traumatic stress disorder, and the challenge of humanitarian intervention in dangerous, complex places like Syria. With that, please join me in giving a warm Lawrence University Björklunden welcome to Senator Russ Feingold.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Brozick. First, it's so good to see a number of friends that I haven't seen for a while up in this wonderful county, and I, of course, am well aware that the Packer game is not on right now, otherwise there would not be this kind of a crowd. And of course, the professor was, a couple of people asked me, why am I up here? Well, it's because of the kindness of Lawrence University. No institution has treated me better since I left the Senate than Lawrence. They immediately asked me to come and speak at the graduation last year and receive an honorary degree, which was a wonderful weekend, and then asking me to come here for 2 beautiful weeks with the weather perfect to be the visiting scarf professor. Actually, of course, Professor Brozick is the permanent scarf professor, but this is in memory of a young man who graduated, as I understand, from Lawrence, roughly in my era, and a very promising young man who wanted to be, I believe, a diplomat and was killed, I believe, in a car accident. And so, I think about a young man like that and the wonderful opportunities I've had, and it's an honor to be able to speak to students, teach students, and learn from students at Lawrence, which is a great place. And this place, Björklunden, is also very special. I held one of those 1,300 listening sessions in this very place. Not long after, and I know President Warch is here somewhere. Where is he? Is he still here? Not long after he, I've been told this story several times, made the critical decision as the president of Lawrence University to do something very difficult, which was to not sell this property, but to keep this and to make it better. And I want to express my gratitude to you, Mr. President, for that, for doing that. So they've worn me out pretty good at Lawrence the last 2 weeks. We've taught a lot of classes about different things, but I was asked to come here to speak to all of you, including the Boynton Society, which, as I understand, is devoted to the preservation of this place. And so I want to thank you for your devotion to this and for your making this possible for people who come here, and especially the students who, I can tell from the conversations I've had, really enjoy coming out here. And I think Professor Poder and others were explaining to me that this is unique. If there's another university that has something like this somewhere else, tell me. But I think it's exceptional to have this alternative and provide the opportunity for intellectual reflection and camaraderie in this kind of a setting. So what was I asked to talk about? Partisanship. The complete opposite of what I was just talking about. And, you know, I don't have prepared notes for this, but one of the things I've been teaching, both at Marquette University Law School and will shortly be teaching at Stanford Law School, is a course I've essentially invented about the United States Senate in the context of the Constitution, its relationship, in effect, a way of looking at the Constitution instead of through the eyes of the Supreme Court and court cases through what the Senate is supposed to be. Now, this does relate to the topic of partisanship in a very serious way. But you have to go back to the founding of the country and to the origins of the Senate itself to think a little bit about, you know, what is the Senate supposed to be? It's not actually an easy question to answer. Everybody's got a one-liner about what the founders intended. You know, some people say, well, you know, we live in a democracy, everything's supposed to be by majority vote. That's what the Senate was supposed to be, 2 co-equal legislative branches. Others have a little different story, and one of the first stories that I was given when I went to the United States Senate was the perhaps apocryphal story, but it certainly reflects a sentiment that is real, that Thomas Jefferson, who was not at the Constitutional Convention, came back and asked George Washington some questions. And one question that he asked was, why did you make the United States Senate like this? I don't really understand it. And I guess they were having breakfast or tea or whatever it was. And apparently Washington took his coffee, and yes, it was coffee at the time, not yet tea. And he took the coffee and he poured it out of the cup into the saucer. And he says, just as the cup, the saucer is to the cup, the Senate is to be the cooling saucer of our government. That is the central myth or notion, that it was supposed to, you know, kind of not just slow things down, but lead to thoughtful deliberation by the upper house, so that there was not just 2 majority votes and that's it, whoever the controlling party is. Now, some people will question not only whether the story is true or whether that was intended to allow something like a supermajority, a filibuster rule, and a cloture rule. But it's interesting to also look at the context in which they were living. They clearly were not trying to create a one-house, pure majority institution. They came from a different tradition. And even though they fought for freedom from Britain, they respected what was considered the tripartite nature of the English Constitution, which of course was not a written constitution, but had developed after the time of absolute monarchy into a tripartite balance. In fact, it was sometimes described as the perfect equiposition of the Commons, the House of Lords, and the King. Ironically, as I've had a chance to read a little bit about this when I've been in Oxford recently, taking out books about this that have no reference to the United States. They're just about how the House of Lords was perceived. Apparently, the seminal document that sort of sets out this balance, that the monarchy and the aristocracy and the common people were to be balanced, was in a statement made by, an answer to the House of Commons made by Charles I when he was under tremendous pressure just before the English Civil War. It's a bit ironic because he had a bad end, to say the least. But his statement about this perfect positioning of the glorious English Constitution was cited by many. And the House of Lords, even though in the first half of the 19th century, about the 1830s, came under tremendous attack by, I know Professor Poder probably knows this stuff better than I do, by the people like Jeremy Bentham and others. They said, look, we got to get rid of the House of Lords. For 130 years, it was held in high regard. And so when our country was founded, the House of Lords and the idea of a second house, of not just one house, was held in high regard. In fact, there were those who posed it against what they considered to be the excesses of the French Revolution, without that kind of balance. And so it seems to me, although I'm continuing to study it, and there's not a lot of guidance in the founding, in the Articles of Confederation or in the Constitutional Convention or even in the Federalist Papers, there's some guidance. There's not enough guidance to tell us exactly whether they believed that a minority could be able to hold up legislation. I mean, it doesn't say filibuster anywhere in there. But one thing is clear. They feared faction. They feared parties. They did not want parties or partisanship to control their government. And I am confident that one of their goals was a properly constituted Senate as a cooling saucer was supposed to be a protection against that. Now, it had other purposes as well. It was to make sure that the states would not lose their sovereignty, if you will, that the states would not be completely subsumed under the federal government. As you probably know, they had to go to a new constitution because the Article of Confederation was almost impossible to make work because every state had a complete veto. Each state had a total veto. Well, they had to override that, but they didn't want to go too far, so they made sure that in the United States Senate, every state, regardless of its size, has the same number of senators. So somebody corrected me recently, it could be 3, it could be 4, but Vermont gets the same as California. And one of the things I discovered in reading about this was that there's only one provision in Article 5 of the Constitution which provides for the power to amend the Constitution that can't be amended. And there was something to do with slaves. It's now irrelevant, thank God. But the only thing that lasts, the only thing that cannot be changed, you can eliminate the president, you can eliminate the Supreme Court, who knows what you can, there's only one thing you cannot change, and that is that each state gets the same number of senators. Think about that. So even if there was a constitutional amendment, there have been some law reviews articles written about, what would that mean? So think about how serious they were about having this kind of a body. Now, it seems really weird to a lot of us over the years to think about how California has the same number of votes as Vermont. But it is clear that that was fundamental because the states would not have ratified the Constitution had it not been for that kind of assurance, and not all the states even voted to ratify the Constitution. So that's how it was set up. Now, sometimes people say, well, the filibuster has always been there. It's always been partisan. That's just not true. There's very little record of filibusters. In fact, there's now a lawsuit that's been filed by Common Cause that's being briefed, a very interesting reading, that essentially argues that the filibuster is an illicit add-on that was not intended at all by the founders of the country. Now, that's a difficult argument, but the truth is there were some filibusters, if you want to call it that, in the middle of the 19th century. I think it comes from a Spanish word having to do with piracy, filibustero or something like that. So this was an attack that was made by one senator against other senators when they were trying to talk a bill to death. But there was no mechanism to cut off debate under the rules. There was no rule until the early 20th century when they finally decided they had to come up with a cloture rule. And who do you think irritated them so bad that they decided to do that? Who do you think mounted the filibuster that led to that? Fighting Bob LaFollette, you bet. And what was the issue? Staying out of World War I. And who was mad at him? Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson condemned the senators who were doing this filibuster. And this is after LaFollette had supported Wilson for president. Even though he was a Republican, he got Teddy Roosevelt. Arthur, was it? No, it would have been, who would have been the, Taft, excuse me, Taft. Yeah, it was Taft, Roosevelt, Roosevelt, and LaFollette. So they finally decided to set up a rule that after a while you could cut off debate. But notice, it was not about political parties. It was about an issue. Same thing occurred later on. We all grew up, many of us, I shouldn't say we all, those of us with the gray hair grew up hating the word filibuster. Why? Because it represented the Southern senators' effort to stop the Civil Rights Act. It had a very bad name. And so over time, rules were made. Sometimes it was 2/3 of just the senators present, or 70%, or different variations, but they created an idea of cloture to allow you to have, after a while, a vote to cut off debate so you could go to a vote, a majority vote. But again, even in the civil rights movement, that was not partisan. It was more regional. It was not Democrats versus Republicans. And it was relatively rare. Even when I got to the United States Senate in 1993, every once in a while you'd say to somebody, if you do this, I'm going to filibuster. 90% of the time you didn't feel like it and you didn't do it. Sort of a threat. And usually it came in the form of, sort of the Jimmy Stewart thing. Somebody would get out there and talk for a while. Strom Thurmond, I guess, made it the longest ever. Bill Proxmire, one of the longest. I did one that wasn't that long, but it was kind of fun. Barbara Mikulski was trying to jam through a housing appropriations bill, and somebody had thrown in something there to change the milk marketing order system, for disadvantaging Wisconsin. So I got the floor, and my staff had gotten me a bunch of books, cookbooks, and some like history of cheese. And I got out there, totally straight face, for 2 hours reading cheese recipes. Camembert's the king of cheeses, Finally, Mikulski, who you don't want to mess with, said, "How long is the senator going to talk?" And I said, "Well, as long as this provision's in the bill." They took it out, and she got her bill. This had nothing to do with Democrats versus Republicans trying to shut down the American government. It had to do with something that was considered a right of a senator, something that you did when you felt passionately either about a moral issue or about an issue for your state, but it was not to control the body. What happened during the 18 years I was in the Senate, through both parties' fault, is it became routine. And it became routine to try to stop it from the beginning, so that the fault lies on both sides. One party would be in power, so the other party would say, well, we're going to not let you vote on this, or we're going to put up an amendment and then filibuster the amendment so the bill can't go through. So what did the other party do, often the Democrats? Well, they immediately filed cloture. I mean, literally, the bill is introduced on a Monday, and that afternoon, they filed a petition to cut off debate before there's been any debate at all. So this is how it got jammed up. It got worse, and it got worse, and it got worse, until, of course, the last few years, particularly after the Tea Party became so strong, they decided and promised their supporters that they would make sure President Obama would get absolutely nothing. And they used the filibuster in order to do the best they could. And the only reason they didn't get away with it on health care, as you know, was through a very ugly process of passing the health care bill in the first place, because we had 60 votes on our side, but some of the votes were obtained in a way that was not very attractive, particularly Ben Nelson's little insurance scam for Nebraska. And then we lost that 60th vote when the late Senator Kennedy passed away, and we lost to Scott Brown. We didn't have 60 votes. We couldn't break the filibuster, but because of the way the procedures work, we were able to pass the bill in the House, and there were rules that allowed that to happen. But after that, there were no longer 60 votes, and of course you can't always count on, when the Senate's really operating right, you shouldn't be able to count on 60 votes on your side every time, even if you have 60, because presumably people can still disagree, and you may not want to vote for cloture with your own party. But my point is that this has devolved into the point where it has sort of undercut the very notion that I assume the founders had, which was that there would be discussion and debate, that there would be plenty of time to look at issues. There's such a thing as putting a hold on a bill in the Senate. That's been abused as well. That was literally meant, hey, look, I haven't had a chance to read the bill. Could I have 2 weeks? Now it's done in a serial way by individual senators to delay legislation. So it's essentially brought the institution to a standstill. And I don't believe for a minute that that was what was intended by our founders. So some people say, what should we do about it? Should we get rid of the filibuster? Well, I think people should think a bit before they do something like that. My view is that any institution, a faculty, I have been at faculty meetings now. Somebody said to me at Marquette, how does this compare to the U.S. Senate? I said, it's kind of similar. But There are rules. I heard the dean of the Marquette Law School talking about the rules of those meetings. There are rules at the Rotary Club. There are rules, I assume, in almost every organization. Rules can never account for total abuse. If people are willing to use rules to the nth degree, no set of rules can survive that. So the notion that you have to undo the Senate or turn it into a purely majoritarian body, I think is a little hasty. I heard Tommy Thompson ask that on the debate the other night, and he said, yeah, I think it should be majority. He said 52%, and then he corrected himself that it was. That was mean, but I did hear him say that. So the point is that you do need to have an opportunity to question things, and an institution cannot survive if rules are abused. But the other side of the coin is I noticed a number of occasions where I'm really glad there was a 60-vote rule. And, you know, for example, when the contract with America came in 1994, they had a pretty aggressive agenda that included repealing most of the labor and environmental laws that many of us had fought for, and long before me, for 100 years. And one of the things I remember is I was a new senator, and I heard that Senator Kennedy wanted me on the floor right away. Well, you better believe, I mean, I wanted this guy to be president when I was 14. So I was in awe that I was, you know, anywhere near the guy. So I get down there, and he sees me as this enormously charming manner, and he says, go ahead. So I gave my little speech for 5 minutes, and noticed he was talking to his staff and wasn't paying much attention to me. And I finished, and he looked over and he went, keep talking. And I said, I don't have anything more to say. He said, we don't care what you're saying, Russ. This is a filibuster. They're trying to take away the Davis-Bacon law on prevailing wages. So I don't know what I did. I came up with something, but, you know, of course, Clinton would have vetoed them, but they would have repealed many important laws if it was simply a 51-vote deal. So I think people should think a little bit before saying, yeah, let's just make it majority vote. The point is, we have to get away from the partisanship. It has to be understood that this is to be done on occasion, and it should not be proof of your loyalty to your party or to your wing of your party, whether or not you always vote for cloture or support a filibuster. And so how are we going to get that done? Well, there's some talk about changing the rules some, and I think there might be room for that. One thing to notice about the filibuster is that you are required to get 60 votes, an absolute 60. So it's not 60% of those present. 60 of you have to be there. As I like to say, all the Republicans or all the Democrats can be in the Bahamas as long, and they can be gone, because you need to get 60 absolute votes present. If we made it 60% of those voting present, it would change the whole thing, because senators like their weekends. And so you could do that without, you know, doing some of the other people say, let's bring it down to 55 votes and so on and so forth. But it seems to me, instead of taking the extreme step, there can be reform. But, you know, that's not going to solve the problem completely either, because my thesis here is that it has to do with whether or not we say to people, that you, as the public, say to people, we do not honor pure obstructionism. We want you to work together. We will fight during the campaigns. You'll fight for your party, I'll fight for mine. But what we want from you is that when you get into office, you do, at least in some areas, try to work together to solve problems. Now, that's the message I used to get from you folks. When I first knocked on doors as a state Senate candidate in Columbia County, when I was 29 years old, and now I'm 59, I'd come to the door and I noticed right away that if I even said the words Republican or Democrat, like basically they didn't want to talk to you anymore. That was a great lesson. They wanted to hear what I had to say. They wanted to hear what ideas I had. They didn't want to hear that back and forth stuff. And then I've told the story many times. Many of the students have already had to hear some of my stories this week, for which I apologize. But when I was doing my town meetings in the early 90s, I think I went to Wapaka County, and my practice was to let people just talk about whatever they wanted. I didn't set the topic, but I would try to start off just saying, okay, I'm working on this bill for a couple minutes, and then I'd start calling on people. So one time I came in, I just said, want you to know that John McCain and I are working on a bill. Hey, everybody just cheered wildly. And I went, how do you know it isn't, ban the dairy industry or something? Essentially, they didn't care. Because what they were saying to us was, we want you, after you're elected, to work with the other party. Nothing used to make Wisconsinites feel better than that. That was the spirit of this state of Warren Knowles and Gaylord Nelson. And so I've always assumed that's what people wanted. And it stood me in good stead. It wasn't just McCain Feingold. I believe I can document, although with PolitiFact now you have to be very careful. I have some reason to believe that I had more bipartisan initiatives than any member of the United States Senate, even though I was also considered by some to be very, on one side. And so there is no ideological barrier. You don't have to be a moderate. You don't have to be in the center. I think that's a myth. Sometimes this whole partisanship thing, people think that means that you all have to sort of trim your sails and not have strong beliefs and just sort of cut the difference. That can lead to awful legislation. A lot of times it's big money that's getting the people to come together. But people of completely different philosophies can agree on the same solution, which is exactly what John McCain and I did in believing that unlimited contributions to political parties was an unwise thing. And so in the end, it's up to you. You should demand of anybody you're voting for, and when you see them in the coming days, this is when they'll really talk to you. Say, I'm going to vote for you. But when you come back to me in 2 years and 4 years and you want my vote again, tell me exactly who you worked with on the other side and what you got passed. Because if you didn't, I'm not voting for you again. Because here's a little clue that I think you already know. Did you know that politicians don't always lead? A lot of times they follow. And if the message they get from the left and the right and from Fox News and MSNBC is that you're a traitor to work with the other side, that's exactly what they'll do. And that's what they've done. People think, wow, you guys are so rough on each other out there. No, they're not. It's a show. People are perfectly pleasant to each other. They feel they have to act this way so people won't yell at them back home. So I want you to yell at them, but I want you to yell at them to work together. That's how you're going to counter partisanship. I'll be happy to answer questions.
I've got one. This is the category of our right to know. Did those replacement reps, were they all Tea Party?
Now that story's about to break. that they were in fact all Tea Party.
Russ, you talk about sort of a rational way out of this, and it seems like it's been very irrational in the past 4 years. It's almost been a blood sport in terms of blocking one side versus the other. It seems like Citizens United has certainly poisoned the waters, given the influence of money. And so I guess I'm not so hopeful. How do you speak in the face of trying to have us talk to our candidates in a way that can overcome that? It seems it's going to be a long road.
Well, if I sounded overly hopeful, I apologize. Because I want to be perceived as, in the real world, things are very bad. I am by nature an optimist. I refuse to believe that all these decades of people preferring people working together has just gone away forever. I believe it's a function of the economy in part, that things have been bad in the last few years. I believe people will adopt a different attitude going forward. I believe the president will be reelected. And when he is, the tactic that I've been talking about, which has been used by both sides, but particularly employed in the last few years against President Obama, will have failed. It will have failed to say, elect me and I will stop everything from happening, which one would think wouldn't have had a lot of appeal anyway, but it did in 2010 because people were upset and one party controlled everything. So what I've been saying in my sort of stump speeches to Democrats is, Democrats are actually pretty good at handling defeat, but we're not always ready for victory. Remember when Al Gore did this whole routine about how you're going to wake up the next morning after the election, there'd be a newspaper, and George Bush would have won, and there would be clouds, and it would be dark. Or Al Gore would have won, and it would be sunshine, and so. Well, What I'm suggesting is that there could be a sunshine moment coming really soon when these tactics lose. When calling somebody a socialist and saying he wasn't born in the United States and deciding on the night of his swearing in with a group of people, including Paul Ryan, that you will do everything you can to destroy his presidency, that will have lost. That's energizing and exciting. Even for Romney people, it should be a good thing. Because we cannot survive as a nation, and we will never have a good system if people try to destroy a presidency from day one. We didn't even do that when George Bush didn't really win. We didn't. We didn't do that to him. So Obama wins overwhelmingly, and this tactic is used. And I really think that this president, and I know this is a nonpartisan event, but I believe in this guy's character. I believe that he does want all Americans to be part of this process. I don't think he's a hateful person or a vengeful person. I think he is thoughtful, and that he is going to have some wonderful directions for this country, internationally and domestically, and that things are going to look a lot brighter once we get through that. So that's why I'm hopeful.
Why was it when, during that time when Cantor looked like he was going to be taking over not necessarily by a vote, but over Boehner's position as like the leader of, I mean, that was when the whole government was going to shut down and Boehner was negotiating. Why was it that everybody, it seemed like all the Republicans just signed right on to that instead of wanting to negotiate, do you think?
Well, there was
Is it money?
the people that were at this dinner, and this has been documented. You know, it's one of these things, I hope nobody tells me later on it didn't happen, but books have been written about it. There was a dinner on the evening of January 20th. And I know this because I served under both Democrat and Republican presidents. When you win, you get to go to the inaugural ball. You know, you get to go to the parties. If you're on the other side, you just got to like find a reservation somewhere in Washington because you're by yourself. And so that's where I was. You know, when Bush won both times, and you know, happy to be at the swearing in, but Republicans didn't want to be lonely, so that night, Newt Gingrich and Eric Cantor and Paul Ryan and a few others went to the Palm Restaurant, which was created by the two leading lobbyists in Washington, and they made this pact that they wouldn't cooperate with the president. And so these were the directions. And I don't know, maybe Boehner was there too. I'm not very familiar with the whole Cantor versus Boehner thing. All I can say is this was a decision that was made and implemented over the last couple of years.
A few years ago, I was at a town meeting, Senator Feingold, where you held court in Egg Harbor. And at that point in time, the debt was rising on the horizon, was getting a lot of light. And your basic answers to, I thought, needs out of the audience was, there isn't any money. There isn't any money. And I don't hear the Democrats coming up with a lot of solutions on the debt. It's like the ultimate fear that we're going to just collapse and the whole world economy is going to collapse if we collapse. So you better vote for us Republicans because we've got some ideas at least. Is there any, your perspective, you're no longer in the Senate, but is there any hope of this death threat of the debt coming to some form of resolution?
It has to. And when I first ran for the United States Senate in 1992, we had the largest deficit in American history at the time, which seems tiny by comparison now, but didn't seem so at the time. When I ran for the U.S. Senate, I proposed an 82-point plan to get rid of the deficit. It was based on Congressional Budget Office recommendations. And I knew I was winning the primary, even though supposedly I had no chance, when Jim Moody came out with a 96-point plan, because they had made fun of it. Well, you know, I didn't come up with these suggestions. The CBO did it. And so when we came in, President Clinton had the guts to, he hadn't run on the deficit. Clinton ran on middle class tax cut and health care. He went down to Arkansas, invited a bunch of business people down there and said, you know what, we got to solve this deficit problem. And we passed the Deficit Reduction Act in 1993 with no Republican help. But then the Contract with America people came out, and they actually were devoted to this issue as well. And on a bipartisan basis, Gingrich and all these people, we came together And we got rid of the deficit completely by the time George Bush became president on a bipartisan basis. That didn't mean we fell in love, but both parties realized what you said is true. Now the debt is absolutely frightful. And it's going to take a lot longer period to bring it down, but it can be done if we enact a glide path, as we did with the Clinton bill, which was a 5-year initial period, and then another 5 years after that was put into place, that takes it in chunks. For that to happen, you can't have things just sealed off. And the problem with the Republican approach is they won't come to the table and talk about any taxes any higher on upper income people. They just wall it off. And Democrats are very squeamish about, obviously, Medicare and Medicaid. I happen to think that those have to be government programs and Social Security. But that doesn't mean as long as that assurance is given, which Mr. Ryan does not give. But if that assurance is given, then there can be have to be mature conversations about fixing that stuff. And the fun thing about town meetings in the early 90s was people came with more ideas about what we could cut. It was like a fun project. People come in, there was, this tea, remember there was a tea board? Remember this? See, this is a long time ago, but there was a national tea tasting board that we didn't need anymore. There was a wool and mohair subsidy that was giving tons of money to wool farmers, particularly, I think, in the South, in Texas, so that we could have nice wool uniforms for our troops. Well, wool really isn't used for troops anymore. But we were still pouring this money at them. You see, that's a great, fun national project. But when you do it in a way that acts like government is horrible and it can't be solved, if you do it like we did in the 90s, which was great, then it can be a fun thing for us all to do. And one of my favorite things is when it was like something that was save money and was better for the environment. The sort of, as they say in Green Bay, double bubble for that. I completely agree with you both, one of my nicknames there was deficit hawk. It was sometimes said in a denigrating way. Wellstone used to come over to me and say, "What is it with you people in Wisconsin and this deficit stuff?" And I said, "Well, we're sort of penny pinchers. We kind of believe you should pay for what you do." I actually said to him, "Paul, even the Communist Party, if they don't pay their bills, they'll come and take the tables and the chairs away. It's not ideology. It's just a way to run a business." And so that's one of the great Wisconsin attributes that I hope always continues, is this devotion to fiscal responsibility.
Can I say thank you for that answer on behalf of Kayleen Brereton, who's in your memory bank from...
What a wonderful woman. Is the house still in at the lake?
Yes. So,
Fond memory.
thank you.
You talked about ways that we can get our elected officials to act more responsibly and more, frankly, maturely together. But a lot of times you see that problem, it doesn't start with them. It starts with the people. I mean, you said that President Obama is, he's not a vengeful man, but there are people who will honestly tell you they think he's trying to hurt the country. And whether you agree or disagree with his policies, you should be able to say, no, he's doing what he believes is right. But people get locked in this cycle where they just spew this vicious talk and they just fortify themselves in it. So when you're somebody trying to represent a moderate point of view, you say, come on, it doesn't have to be like that. People will shut you out a lot of times. So what do you think is a way we can attack that problem where the people are dividing into factions, not just the political parties?
Very difficult, but one thing that I tried to do, even as arguably the most severe critic of the Bush administration on many issues, certainly Iraq and civil liberties, I was the leading critic, is, I tried to, even in the toughest, sort of most left audience, is say something positive about the president. What President Bush did on HIV/AIDS in Africa was truly historic. It was one of the greatest humanitarian programs of all time, and I was surprised when he did it. But what I tried to do was sort of humanize the situation. I mean, this is in the context of where I was saying that his warrantless wiretapping program was an impeachable offense. But I wasn't stating it to be vituperative. I was stating it that you can't just make up laws, Mr. President. But you can say these, even the toughest things, in a way that is not hateful or suggesting some fundamental personal thing about the president. And, you know, the way this president's been treated is, in my view, shameful.
To expand on his point, it seems to me that the problem is people are looking at every situation as a zero-sum game, that one side wins, one side loses. In your experience as a senator, how did you approach people who, in the Senate, who were otherwise seemed to be stonewalling or unable to compromise and try to find a win-win situation for them to agree to?
Well, you know, some people in some issues there was no hope. I mean, they just felt, you know, for example, this healthcare thing became so radioactive that there was no way. But generally speaking, the goal was to find, you know, a few people who hadn't completely decided, and to reason with them. We had to do that on campaign finance. We only had a few co-sponsors at first, and then we started gradually working other people, getting a lot of no's, and then finally we were up around 58, 59 votes. And after the 2000 election, the last guy I would have expected to come on board, Thad Cochran, who's a senator from Mississippi, very courtly gentleman, but just down the line conservative. He just walked up to John McCain and said, you know, I just can't take it anymore. They're asking for this kind of money, you know, out of the blue. So, you know, if somebody has sort of got a harsh agenda, and I'll name names, Jim DeMint of South Carolina, he's there to make sure none of this happens. A guy like Thad Cochran, he's not there for that reason. He comes from a completely different background. You know, when you sit in Jefferson Davis's Senate seat, which is what it is, you know, you give a different perspective than when you come from our part of the country. But his purpose isn't to come there and make sure nothing happens. And so you have to distinguish between those who are potentially gettable and those who aren't. And sometimes that's the most fun thing about being in a state legislature or Congress, is the surprising moment when people of different opinions, different parties come together. And I loved watching Hillary Clinton do this. You know, they thought she was going to be impossible. Well, those Republicans fell in love with her. You know, they loved working with her because everybody got a big kick out of it. Because she did a ton of bipartisan stuff. She got in there, and the first thing she did was figure out how could she do a bill basically with every single Republican. And so, you know, there's always something, almost always something you can agree on, other than with Jim DeMint.
When and what office will you run for again here?
I don't know. You know, I don't know if I want to do that again. I enjoyed it. It was an incredible privilege, 28 years in a row. Nice to have doing something else for a while, believe me. It feels good. And there's a lot of other wonderful things in life, like reading books instead of briefing papers, you know. But we'll see. You know, I don't have a burning desire to run for office, but it may be appropriate at some point for me to try to serve again, but I don't feel in a hurry.
Senator, we're in the midst of a national 9-state election. What do you think about the Electoral College?
You said it all. It doesn't make any sense anymore. When I was in high school, I was one of these debater guys, you know, and so I went to the Eau Claire Debate Institute at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, and I had to write a paper for the summer project, so I studied there at the library. I wrote my paper about this archaic institution, the Electoral College, and whether we should get rid of it, and it doesn't matter because it'll never happen anyway, right? Well, it happened. It happened to Al Gore, and it's wrong. It's absurd that the majority of the votes in the country don't decide it, even though this is part of this fine Swiss watch that our founders created. It's part of it. 2 senators for every state, and the senators were to be chosen by the state legislatures. We took away that part of the Swiss watch under Bob La Follette and others when we decided senators should be directly elected. So the Electoral College was also to protect the prerogatives of the states. But I think most people would agree it just doesn't make sense in this kind of society. States, you know, people from California and New York, they just, or Nebraska, you know, there's no issue with regard to the presidential race. One of the leading proposals out there that is catching on is to have each state pass a law saying all of our electoral votes will go to the candidate that gets the most votes nationally. Because you're not going to get a constitutional amendment passed. because there's enough states that will ban, but it would have the same effect, and I do support that movement.
Is GlassSteagall better than Dodd-Frank? And if so, is it possible to have that reauthorized?
Dodd-Frank doesn't come close to resurrecting the necessary aspects of GlassSteagall that we needed. And that's why I was the only Democrat to vote against Dodd-Frank, because it didn't protect us. And an awful lot of liberals and the White House and others were furious with me, but this was one of those issues where I'm like, I'm not voting for this thing and make people think we've solved this problem, because we haven't. We haven't created the proper distinction that was there under Glass-Steagall between investment houses and banks. We didn't do it. That bill was way too infected with the powers that be. The president appointed people, unfortunately, who were way too close for that part of his administration to Wall Street. It's one of the things I'm a co-chair of the Obama campaign. But that is an area of fault, and we need stronger legislation. You won't reenact Glass-Steagall exactly because of changes, but you do need more legislation in that area. Take a couple more.
I see the partisanship out in the fringes in other ways, and I'm troubled by the plethora of campaign and electoral laws around the country. And I see all the states having their own ways of holding elections. And I see shenanigans, and I see money being wasted and attention being diverted from the issues. Can that ever be standardized? Can we all be using the same system, the same days, Saturdays and Sundays or whatever?
I mean, this is something that has traditionally been left to the states in a way that I think is good unless there are abuses. But obviously there were horrendous abuses that led to some of the most important legislation in the history of our country, when particularly in southern states, efforts were being made to prevent people from voting, and were successful. I like the flexibility that Wisconsin has had to have more liberal voting laws over the years than perhaps a national law would allow. A national law may prevent us from having same-day registration. Now, having said that, this movement, as strongly as I feel about campaign finance and about money in politics, this movement to intimidate people into not voting by using voter IDs is one of the most vicious things I've ever seen done in the United States of America. It's absolutely vicious. And so we could be entering a place where, if this is going to be done on a state-by-state basis, where we're going to have to look at what you just said. Because we cannot tolerate a situation where people don't feel comfortable voting. I know from the recall that when they were starting to do the efforts to get out the vote, not just in the central cities, but in rural Dodgeville, people reported to me that a couple older women had said to them, I'm not going to vote. I voted every time for 70 years. I'm not going to vote because I'm not sure I know how to do it anymore. See, that's part of the game. People uneasy, people that don't go out, normally, people that aren't comfortable, they had a comfort zone, and they knew how to vote, and they didn't have to show up with an ID. Not everybody has a car. Not everybody has a driver's license. So this is wrong. And so I would prefer to allow state experimentation, but I think both litigation and actually our Supreme Court in Wisconsin did something right for a change. They decided not to take up this voter ID identification thing between now and the election, which means that the rules that we've had in place will be in place. But it's a very, very serious matter.
Do you think the media has a large part to play in the polarization right now? And if so, what would you say should be done about it?
Yeah, the media, yeah, they don't have TVs here, so that's one. Clearly the media's had a role. I mean, I remember, well, first of all, and I would never change this, but the Senate didn't used to be on TV. And so senators used to sort of talk candidly with each other. And they didn't have this feeling that 10 minutes after they said something nice to somebody on the other side, they get blasted on Fox News or MSNBC. So that's what we start with, and I don't want to change that, but I want to acknowledge that that has sort of driven people underground in terms of being in open debate, being cooperative with each other. Then the advent of Fox News and talk radio and Rush Limbaugh and all that, that sort of took me by surprise how popular that became, because it just seemed so rude and, one-sided, but there's a real market for it. In fact, I've talked to some people at CNN who, you know, they're taking a real bath at CNN. And that's because they don't go to both sides. I'm not saying they're good or bad, I'm just saying they don't go down the middle and try to just, they try to just report, and it's not, people want that edge. And so that creates part of the problem. So yes, the media is part of it, but I believe in free speech. You know, I believe give the people the truth and the freedom to discuss it, and all will go well. And so I don't think the answer is to restrict them, but people, I would hope, would basically vote with their clickers or remotes or whatever and seek out something, a variety. I've always told people, I watch Fox News, you know, and they go, no, boo, and I say, no, it's great. I knew what my opponent was going to say in the elections a week before he did. You know, so, but in all seriousness, you learn something. You learn something when you watch MSNBC, you watch CNN, you listen to Limbaugh, you listen to how they're handling something. I mean, I knew that this Romney 47% thing was as bad as I suspected it was when Fox News had a special segment about how, you know, it's illegal to tape a conversation at a fundraiser. It's like, oh boy, if that's all they got. And the same thing on our side. I mean, you know, we have to be careful about, you know, I think the administration made a mistake in the way they handled this Libya thing. What were they doing, sort of quickly saying, oh no, this wasn't al-Qaeda. Okay, it's September 11th. You know, how do you know? I was on the Intelligence Committee for 5 years. These things are hard to figure out. And so, you know, in the rush to sort of wanted to say, okay, this isn't, you know, things aren't happening again from al-Qaeda, they jumped too quick and gave Romney an opening, which I believe will be one of his last shots here, is to say that that was not accurate. But you see, that's the same problem. It's they're trying to you know, manage the media, manage the news, and people have to be engaged in looking at different opinions and be open to the possibility that their side doesn't always get everything right. It shouldn't be a crime to admit that you haven't done everything right. It should be, you know, like a mature thing to do. I'll take one more.
What's the inevitability of war with Iran?
It's not inevitable, and it certainly shouldn't be inevitable. I am in agreement with the President that all options have to be on the table, which is what he said in the State of the Union. That does not mean you lead with the most extreme option, which would be a war or invasion. I certainly hope that Israel shows restraint or is able to show restraint between now and the election, because there's widely differing views on where they're at with this program. I am of the view that they cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. I do agree with that. But those who really study Iran, and I'm not an expert, but I've studied some of their work, see it as the complex country that it is. It is not Saddam Hussein's Iraq, where one guy calls all the shots. Ahmadinejad is not all-powerful. Khamenei is not all-powerful. It is a complex society, an ancient society, where influence and political change can occur through different means than invasion. The one way to make sure they'll unify is to do something like that. If you read the book, The Persian Puzzle by Pollock, he traces back what everybody else traces it back to. Our trouble with Iran is not historic. It goes, well, it's not ancient history. It goes back to the coup of Prime Minister, was it President? Prime Minister? Mossadegh, but Prime Minister or President, I'm trying to remember. Prime Minister, I think. Prime Minister Mossadegh, you know, the CIA in England, Britain took him out, and there's been a tremendous resentment toward us ever since. But there is not a fundamental hatred of Americans on the streets of Iran. And so there is a possibility of sanctions. There's a lot of evidence that the sanctions are beginning to work and having an effect on the political system. I do believe that we will be able to avoid this, but we have to at least consider that that possibility is on the table. Great seeing all of you. Thank you.